Good morning. I'm Allison Van Dyke. I'm the Executive Director of the Temple of Understanding, and I want to welcome all of you to our Eco-Justice for All dialogue series, today entitled Planetary Grief and Species Extinction. This is a series which is ongoing by the Temple of Understanding, a 63-year-old interfaith organization whose mission is to advocate for interfaith values at the United Nations and around the world. Our focus for the past 12 years has been to increase the awareness of religious leaders and actors of our climate crisis and its negative impact on achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, peace, justice, women's health and safety, food sovereignty, and ensuring a healthy planet for all. It is my pleasure today to introduce our presenters, Arlana Redsky, Larry Rasmussen, and Tiokasin Ghosthorse. Tiokasin is going to be our moderator. Welcome, Tiokasin. The floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Those of you who can, and those of you who might be watching this later, I'd like to welcome Arlana Redsky and Larry Rasmussen to this little panel discussion. And to feel comfortable, I just want to greet you in my language. That way I can be able to bring the indigenous, and where I come from, into, and Mother Earth into the invitation. So a little bit, Tiokasin Chatanzi wiki paha michaja oyate tokai wichaki le onki piki hoya washtelo chante washte na pechus up yellow. Just the things, I'm greeting you in my language because I think it's important to bring that consciousness into what we know and feel as grief among the nations, among Earth and things like that. But I want to be able to go around and have people introduce themselves. And I think we'll do that first, Larry and Arlana, and then Larry, I'd like to come back to you and ask you a question so that we can just get right into it. And because I think this dialogue is very important among us. And we'll ask these may be hard questions, or maybe people are looking for the answer or solution, but I'm sure that because of our experience with where we come from and the lands that we experience will give us part of that, I would say, definition for the sake of this conversation. So I'll go to you, Larry, to introduce yourself first, and then Arlana, and then I'll come back and introduce myself.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to join this group this morning, and grateful for the work of the Temple of Understanding over these many years. I'm a retired academic. I retired at 65. I'm now 84, so I've been retired a long while. And my area of teaching has been social ethics. I was at Union Theological Seminary for about 20 years before the retirement. And I've continued these almost 20 years since retirement, focusing on planetary issues and the great transition from industrialized civilization to ecological civilization. I don't know if this is the place to plug a book, but I'm going to hold it up because it's relatively recent. It's called The Planet You Inherit, Letters to My Grandchildren When Uncertainty is a Sure Thing. So I've written letters about what it looks like if you're an octogenarian and talking to the people that you love who are in the intermediate generations. And in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I live, having moved from New York City, I'm part of a group that's trying to align generations. How do you get the young and the old together on facing the consequences of, well, most people talk about climate change, and that's obviously a matter of great importance, but it's not just that. Right now, it's artificial intelligence and the consequences thereof, or other innovative powers such as genetic and editing and engineering. So it involves changes of worldview, at least for the people who have come from places of privilege, and that's white people overwhelmingly. Changes in the cosmology or worldview, way they apprehend reality itself, how they think about who they are, where they are. Those are big changes, and I spend my time in retirement still trying to address that for the communities from which I have come, which have been rural initially in southwest Minnesota, and then moving on to cities. My wife and I have lived in Washington, D.C. and New York City for most of the last time before moving to Santa Fe in 2004. Maybe that's enough from me. If you want more.
Well, thank you, Larry. That's very interesting, and thank you for that. In your wow, 80 years old. That quite the. I love the planet you inherit. That's I have to read that book. It's good. I'll figure it out somehow. But Arlana, could you come in with introducing yourself? Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Arlana Redsky. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Native Studies. I also work for an organization called the National Consortium of Indigenous Medical Education, and I'm affiliated with the Indigenous Science and Technology Studies Consortium as well. My work has been in the past, I would say 10 years now, on chronic wasting disease of cervids, so deer, moose, elk, and caribou, studying an animal pandemic during a human pandemic really puts a lot of things into context for you, I'd say. In my work, I also look at Indigenous ontologies. So concentric ecology is one of the kind of primary theoretical anchors that I use in my work. And I find it looking at Indigenous languages and our ontological perspectives tends to refocus things in a different way for me. Myself personally, I'm Anishinaabe. My family is from Treaty 1 territory in Canada, what is now called Canada, and Treaty 3 territory, so Shoal Lake and formerly Fort Alexander First Nations. My connection ecologically has been disrupted. My family was part of a diaspora in the 1960s, where they were forcibly, unfortunately, as a result of colonial policies, removed from their home territories, and so ended up losing a lot of their cultural and familial connections. And I now am in the process of reconnecting with my family members who are back in our treaty and traditional territories. Throughout my life, I've also been reconnecting to the ecological, to the environments, and finding plant relations and animal relations that are connected to me and inform who I am as Anishinaabe all over Canada. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlana. Excuse me, little throat thing going on there. Yeah, I guess it traditionally it's very hard to talk about myself in a way that it represents individuality or here's what I'm doing without understanding that we're representing the whole. In our way, Tioshpai, the family, the larger family, the nation, and so there was samples of going home and telling them I've learned all this in another world, which was American society, and then going home and telling people who were born in the early like in 1920s, and then their tradition also from the 1800s is that when you did that, they often were, you know, they were bust out in laughter because it's difficult to talk about yourself in without including others. So that was difficult for me to understand, and finally I said, okay, I'll just come from the Western mind and talk about myself. So it's the I and me, the my, the mine, and ours type of mentality. So this is how I did that, and I come from a family of 9, and the second oldest, and we have, we have different ways that we've gone down life's road, and mine has been always traveling and moving among peoples and different cultures to get to know them. This was my life experience and my education that way, to understand that there's many perspectives. There's not just one, and of course I could say that I've taken on the Western way in order to survive in the Western way, but yet that tradition of who I am usually comes through, and I want to always include the elements that we're here to honor, and to talk about very visceral feelings sometimes, and that we actually can do something about what we're feeling. So introducing me and all the vernacular I just talked about, in the ranges of being insightful, to always remember who my name is, Oyate Tokahe Wichake, which means to put everything and everybody else in front of myself, including the earth. So the base would be earth, and especially the language. And my 89-year-old mother, who's a fluent speaker of Lakota, says that you cannot speak Lakota without intuition. So a lot of that is missing. The consciousness is missing of intuition, and we often talking in linear, as a matter of fact statements, and measuring everything, and that's our value set supposedly. But how much of that culture did we give up as Native people in order to become academics? You see, because that comes along later, and I'm not saying it's not part of who we are. It is part of who we are and encompassing it. So speaking to young people, which I do quite often. I too, Larry, am a faculty at Union Theological, and I teach there presently. So I want to just say that, and I think that's totally enough about me. I don't know if I gave you anything. I have a 32-year-old radio program called First Voices Radio now, and it's always been about talking to people, common people, and experts, but rather those who experience their lives all over the world, every continent, that have to do with, partly with understanding what the complex of machinery or industrialization, and now technological mindsets that actually are getting us away from the consciousness of Earth, and putting us into the conscience of the Western modalities, saying that you have to do the right thing, be a good citizen, and on and on. And I know it feels like I'm rambling because I'm struggling for words to say, but I want to start off with this question, and thank you for listening to me and for your introductions. So I'm going to start off with this question, and I'm sure that people are asking for this, because I've heard this question before. It may not be so easily to answer, but according to your spiritual tradition, whatever that is, what is your definition of grief? And we'll go to you, Larry, first. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for your introductory comments. Okay, according to my spiritual tradition, what is my understanding of grief? My spiritual tradition, broadly speaking, is Christianity, but I'm highly aware that there is no such common understanding of that. So it's always Christianities, plural. And in my case, it's a kind of pietistic Lutheran version rooted in rural communities. I grew up in Southwest Minnesota and farm country, and the focus in the Christianity there was on the inner life. Matters of the heart were most important. It was always kind of laity focused. As Lutheran, you believed in the priesthood of all believers. That is, there is no intermediary who is an authority between you and God. That relationship was a direct one. There was a very strong sense of personal responsibility for what God has entrusted to you, to your community. So in that case, for me, it was responsibility for each other and the land. Now, there's a modification there that I'll get to shortly. But grief is the flip side of personal responsibility. And grief refers to loss. One grieved because of the loss of family members, friends, people in the community who died, or the loss of their capacities, becoming by accident or otherwise disabled, etc. It was a person-centered understanding of loss that elicited the emotion of grief. But I also have to say, because I come from farm stock, even though I lived in a little village, the whole ethos was agriculture, and it was culture. It was a way of life. It wasn't agribusiness. That's a different way of life. Agriculture was one in which the farmers understood that they lived by the grace of God. That is to say, they could not invent one blade of pasture grass by themselves. That was a gift of the Creator to them. So their sense of responsibility was to be good environmental stewards. And that's the language that was used in church, was stewardship. I came later to not appreciate that language, and I'll say why. But I can't get away from the fact that there was a very strong sense of environmental responsibility that came with the farmers. They needed to take care of the land to which they had been entrusted. There was a gift to them by their Creator, and not of their own making. But I was 50 years old before I learned that the largest public lynching in American history happened 90 miles from my home in Mankato, Minnesota, in 1862, I think. And that was what we learned about as the Sioux Wars. And I grew up with people who were these, I would say, good people. They were always helping one another in an agricultural community where we all knew one another. Parents looked out for other people's children, etc., in a small village. But I grew up hearing the good Indian is the dead Indian. There was that unspoken white supremacy and unspoken white privilege in this community that felt to be responsible for the land. So I just want to complicate the picture by saying that that was there. And it was what you'd have to put in quotation marks on innocence. I think the innocence is the crime here, but it was an innocence in that people never thought about themselves as white and privileged, even though we were that in our way of life. So maybe the last thing I'll say about this is that the grief was felt when we had loss that was in an anthropocentric world. And if there was loss that pertained to the land, we had flooding, we didn't have drought. But if there was a loss in the sense of the responsibility for the land, it was felt, but it was unspoken. And people would not talk that way about the land. In the Tiokasin, we never thought of Mother Earth as a community of where we were rooted, even when we felt responsible for the condition for the responsibility of being good stewards to the land. So the white privilege and the white supremacy overrode the deep sense of connection that farmers still felt. I mean, my dad had a little service station, and I always went with him to the farms delivering fuel oil for the farmers. And the farmers often came into the garage of my dad and played cards and played pool and so on. And we kids liked to go there because we liked to listen to them curse. It was great fun. We couldn't do that at home, and there was none at home in the household, but there was in the garage. We did that. And if one of the farmers had been present for the birth of a calf that morning, what was communicated was a sense of the holy. Even though the language was the language that had a lot of swear words in it. So there was a sense of loss if things didn't go well, and there was a sense of responsibility. But I don't like environmental stewardship because it always puts the person, in this case, white farmers, as the subject and land as the object. And the subject acts on the object. The object isn't a reciprocating partner in it. It's we and the land, or they wouldn't say Mother Earth. Okay, that's the tradition. Grief is personal and unspoken grief when loss occurs to the land for which we are responsible.
Well, thank you, Larry. Unspoken grief. I'll note that. That's a good one to talk about. Arlana, what is according to your spiritual tradition and the definition of grief?
I would kind of shift away from the spiritual tradition slightly, and maybe focus a little bit of what Larry's saying, but from my own understanding of grief and its entanglements in North America and across the globe with colonialism. And I find that a lot of what I come to understand through my work and research on the history of conservation and the history of wildlife management is that settler relationships to the land, as Larry pointed out, are typically utilitarian, and grief and loss is expressed in terms of the loss of resources, the loss of crops. And so this doesn't always have a very deep resonance when it comes to grief and loss, because next year maybe the crop will come back, and it's this cycle of utility, right? I find for myself and the Indigenous ontological perspectives that I like to sit with and learn from, grief is a transitory stage, and I'd like to go back a little bit to our understandings of what it means to be in connection with the land. And so our relationship to the lands, as you may know, Tiokasin, our relationship to the land is very much different than the settler relationship to the land. And the land, in many cases, is a mnemonic. It reminds us of who we are. The animals, the plants, they're reminders, and they hold stories, and they tell us who we are, where we come from, how it is that we're still here. And so this very much informs a different understanding of our grief when it comes to ecological loss. Ecological loss for Indigenous peoples has largely been environmental disturbance and destruction as a result of capitalism and settler colonialism. So white supremacy is very much entangled in that control and resource extraction. And so those grievings, again, they tend to inspire a lot of people in our Indigenous communities to not so much grieve, but to take action, to push back. There's a long legacy and history in our communities of land defenders, women water carriers, water holders. This is, I think, very much opposed to what we see in settler communities, where there's no relationship commensurate like this, like there is in our communities. And so, my understanding of grief, I lean more towards our ontological perspectives and our oral tradition and how we are connected to the land very intimately, since time immemorial. And when we say time immemorial, that's not poetics. As settler research is increasingly showing, Indigenous peoples come from these lands very, very literally, and we have been here for tens of thousands of years, if not longer.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, Arlana, for that. I guess it's my turn. So, wow, just thanking you so much for your definitions and your thoughts on grief. And I think I'll start in the same mold as Arlana did, a little bit about the land and grief, where I understand it, how it came here. So I often have this view. I used to have a radio show, which is now transformed into First Voices Radio. Used to be called View from the Shore. And if you think about that view from the shore, which Native people are, and the ships coming, bringing these new ideas, bringing all these other ways of thinking, words that we still don't have in my language, like words like extinction and domination and ownership. Those all are very prevalent now. When we talk about supremacy, that's part of it. Even the words for time, that concept, these concepts are caught up in hard to let go of. So where did the grief come from? When did it start? How did it get here on the ships? It's not that we didn't have it here. It's just how I understand the present definition as a Westerner is understanding it. Is that in 599 with the papacy, the Pope and the church and the kings and queens of feudalistic system that was happening in Europe at that time, with the Black Plague, or the bubonic plague they call it, and the need for human energy, resource energy, human beings were being resourced to uphold the royalty and the church. And with disease happening at the same time, they banned other people from mourning their dead. And so if you were caught mourning your dead, the property was taken away from you, were put in prison or punished or even killed, and the land taken away. And so you didn't have time to grieve. Well, that was instilled in the churches and the government and now brought over to on the ships to the Western Hemisphere. And you see it now still having a hard time to grieve. And part of this understanding that I have is Larry, you mentioned in I'm going to talk about the separation of land, and Arlana, you'll probably talk about this even more as well as you, Larry. The separation of land brought in a sort of a biophobic language.
Mm-hmm.
And in that we don't understand, where's that language? Well, that language is filled with grief, and the ceremonies that we still have to to understand, make ourselves aware of, we are in grieving. And community is a different thing. Community is not just the human factors, it's more of the birds and the air and the elements. That's community to us. How are we being in a relationship with community? And just to not go too much more, is this is affecting us. And Larry, you spoke of unspoken grief. And I think that is a good starting point to go from. And the question that you asked, and Arlana, was grief. You said grief is an emotional state, and that is dependent on the permanent loss of relational connections between persons and elements within the local environment. And I kind of that's what I understand, is that where, especially among young people, you can go to Europe, any places, and they say there's no ceremony. There's ritual, there's not ceremony. Now, my understanding is ceremony is that it's identifying the energy wherever we are with the earth. And that is ceremony. It's not that you have to have the feathers and drums and, things like this, the props, right? Is that you feel this. This is the intuition my mother talks about. You feel the loss, you feel, the abundance, you feel it, and then you're able to describe it in that language. And that language happens to be a language of verbs. And so the language is in many indigenous languages are verb centered. Sometimes up to 90% of the languages of indigenous peoples are about verbs, something alive in the present. And that's why I say biophobia is what we're not seeing in that unspoken grief. So we're speaking a present phobic language. We don't want to be here. We want it to be better because we know where we've been. So in that local environment that you're talking about, Arlana, the local environment is like people are talking about climate change, and yet it's really about personal change. And because, are we really that effective if we don't really change that within ourselves? And this is a self-help mentality. It's like, yes, what you take is an extractive mind, but what are you given? Your language, what are you giving? In your language, you go to any spiritual retreat or religious retreat, and they're packaging, and the packaging happens to be, when I hear, what's your takeaway? That's as if they went shopping. But we often have a thing about, what did you give? What was your giveaway? And that's tied into the traditional sense of the indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere and indigenous peoples everywhere. And I know we can rationalize it into the Western way of being in that linear sense and get into the time factors. But I'm talking about the spatial that we come from as indigenous peoples. At one time, everybody used to come from that before the clock or the invention of time came along to understand how to, I guess, extract resources more efficiently, and labor and things like that. So I wanted just to stop right there, because that should be enough. Just to mention that we have a ceremony called Wiping the Tears ceremony that is dealing with grief, because as we know, Native people have a lot of that, and because we've been taken away from the land. And I think I'll speak to that point. And Larry, your thoughts on grief is an emotional state that is dependent on the permanent loss of relational connections between
Yeah.
pieces and elements.
Yeah.
5 minutes, so that'll be good.
Okay, well, you call me on the dime on this. But this is a rich conversation, and it always is when I'm in circles like this. I realize the depth of what Arlana was saying, that there really isn't any commensurate relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers. We start from such different places. I think some of that's changing, and I want to speak to that in terms of grief. But I want to start there with an appreciation. For example, Tiokasin, I knew nothing about the fact that peoples were banned from mourning their dead. I mean, what does that say about the qualitative difference in seeing the world? Now, the popes you spoke of were the ones that also said, you know, you have rights to all of the land that isn't already under the authority of Christian emperors. I mean, the Pope just gave it away for those people. So that's where I want to start. Now, I think presently there are a couple of different communities of grief, and the grief is quite different in one community from the other. Both of you, Arlana and Tiokasin, are talking about a grief that comes from the literal loss of land and culture, banned from even mourning the dead. Now you have ways of responding that are your own. But that loss of relationship is loss of culture, it's loss of land, it's loss of cosmology, of your own worldview, of your way of speaking. So I think that is one community of grief. Now, the one that I see more of now is quite a different one. And that's people like myself and the communities I know from the Western modality, who are coming to realize, to say it as I said earlier, that our so-called innocence is the crime itself. So I've taught 4 very different groups using the same text. It just happened. I was teaching at Union, at Yale, the seminar in climate ethics, and in Cambridge University in England, the same topic, and in my own congregation, and various church groups around the United States. They're very different constituencies. And I used Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. In the evaluations of the classes, everyone in all of those groups picked that as the favorite text. And what they meant by that is that it was changing their minds about the fundamental relationships that they now have come to question, like environmental stewardship, or a noun language, to use your language, Tiokasin, instead of a verb language. And what Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in the book is the grammar of animacy. Earth is alive. And that's something new for some of us. We knew we were alive, and we thought, you know, what you said, Arlana, you know, it's resource extraction. It's an extractive corporate capitalist economy that's at work here, and Earth is not alive in that kind of economy. And that kind of economy is fundamentally out of relationship with those economies known across the very different indigenous traditions, but they have that family resemblance of Earth is alive. So, what is grief for those of us with this very Western dualistic humanity nature, dualism? What is grief becoming now? It's an awareness of what crimes have been committed in our own names and by us. And the grief then is the grief that comes with a different sense of responsibility than the responsibility that we had as environmental stewards. So I think there are two communities of grieving now. Mm. One is the one who have literally lost culture, land, been banned. Their ceremonies have been banned. Their language. I live in New Mexico. The languages were banned in New Mexico. The Pueblo people, the indigenous people, had the good sense to carry out the Pueblo revolt and kick the conquistadors and Spanish settlers and Franciscan priests out of New Mexico. They came back a dozen years later, and when they renegotiated, the Spanish colonialists decided it wasn't a good idea to take away everything, including language and ceremonies. But that's about the only place in the whole United States where you had this effective change. Some of the land was still taken. And in the case of some of the peoples, the children were separated from the parents and sent off into boarding schools. Okay, I'm going to quit here now and just say that I think there's a difference of the grief that so many indigenous peoples have experienced, which is a literal loss, and the kind of grieving that's happening in some places among white folks, which is a growing awareness of their own responsibility. And then responsibility, I mean, grieving and responsibility go together in this case. And then what to do with that sense. Now, I will also say that there's a lot of folks who don't feel this grief in white communities at all, because their relationship is uninformed by what they have done, and it's uninformed by their own wish to have a different relationship to Earth alive.
Wow. So that's a whole nother session we could have here, but Arlana, thank you for that, Larry. Thank you, Arlana, and your thoughts too about what we've been saying here. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the idea of language, like language distinction. And I think of this in linguistic terms, when we have, English language that is not verb-based, everything is very highly individualistic. The ethics of settler society coming from Europe are very, prescriptive, and they're very much not the same in really any way to indigenous perspectives on ethics. And when we talk about language, I always go back to the idea that, as you said, Tiokasin, that indigenous languages are verb-based, and what that means is that everything is animate. So trees are animate, the ground, the wind, everything has spirit, it is alive. And when we talk about animals, for instance, because I do work with cervids, we talk about the Hoof Nation, Anishinaabe, we'll talk about the Hoof Nation. They are a people that we have treaty with, and so we have relationships with these peoples. And so the disparities between the two, you live in two different worlds, where the Western world sees everything as highly individualistic, is property. Is if it becomes property, it becomes killable and it becomes ownable. In Indigenous ontologies, we don't have that. Everything is communal. Everything gifts itself to us if it is, accepted. And so in those two different worldviews, I think grieving becomes very different. Grieving in settler society, as I'll continue to say, is a loss of those resources, and that's very temporary. But it's also divorced from the idea of any responsibility or fealty, connection, or relational obligations to those entities. And in Indigenous language and ontologies, our perspectives tell us that when something passes, it's not necessarily gone. It's still in the cycle of life, but it's a loss, I think, that is certainly not commensurate with settler perspectives. And to sit with both of these perspectives now in a new awareness for settlers, I think it's important that settler society, settler peoples going forward in an era of climate instability, species extinction, sit with Indigenous nations, listen to what we have to say, and support us in our land defense, support us in our advocacy and our work to defend Mother Earth and to stave off extinction. We've had a lot of loss, and that's passed down genetically. Even epigenetics will bear this out. But I think there's first, before we can move into a state of grief, there needs to be an accounting, and settler society needs to account for its responsibility in the current economic, cultural, social, and especially ecological crises that are happening right now, and to not turn away from that. That is a very large responsibility that settler nations need to be accountable for. And from that place, we can begin healing, which is something that I like to, position everyone in this conversation, is to not focus on the loss, but to focus on the opportunity for healing. Because in Indigenous cultures and our languages, healing is such an important part of grief, because from grief we learn how to heal, how to move forward, how to become adaptable, how to be resilient, and how to survive.
Yeah, thank you again, Larry and Arlana. I mean, Arlana, this is just to elaborate on that a little bit. Could you maybe give us what it means to grieve, in that sense of what I'm thinking is like grieving is not measurable. In that, to me, it you feel it happens, and many people, and we're going to refer to language again. Many people don't have the language to understand what grieving is, because it's usually done in the control of Western psychology. And yet, on the other side, Indigenous peoples, we are. It's not like what do we, what can we do? It's what are we doing? We're here. We're doing something, where the West is just now is waiting for instructions to do something. You see what I'm going? We see where I'm going with that, Arlana?
A little bit, yeah. I see where you're going.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. When I think about these subjects and doing, like, what is it exactly that we should be doing going forward, when we're thinking about this grief, I think about our traditions of grieving, for instance, and some of them would go on for a year or more, and there's particular protocols that are involved in some of our communities, and they're not all the same. But in the Anishinaabe community, for instance, I think of, a particular story that I heard about a widow grieving her husband who died, and she would be in grieving for a year, and there was particular protocols that were associated with that. You know, certain ways to talk with her and whatnot. And so I think, I'm thinking about the incommensurability between these two, worldviews that are inhabiting the same earth, piece of land right now, and how I think we just need to have, Western white supremacy take a seat, um, call it out, and to define the areas where it has become incredibly pervasive, because it is quite pervasive and invisibilized to a lot of people, especially settlers, um, and to maybe privilege a little bit more the Indigenous perspectives on grieving, and making time and space for that grief, and how to work through it, and how to honor it, and then how to move forward into a healing pathway, and in a good way.
Larry, your thoughts? Okay, we have like maybe 4 minutes, and then I'll have to kind of close it up. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I want to connect here because this is for me a very rich discussion of what I see as some changes happening. First of all, what Arlana's talking about is settler society and settler mentality doesn't have the language yet for the grief that it increasingly has an emotional sense for as we become more and more aware of the crimes that have been committed in the name of white privilege and supremacy. We're just not there yet. We're looking for rituals. And I know of some rituals that are, I think, important. Churches in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany have had masses for the dead, but it are dying glaciers. Ash Wednesday Christian service in California, the church went to the ashes of a fire around Ojai, California for Ash Wednesday, and used the ashes from the fire for making the sign of the cross on the foreheads. And they talked about all of the kin who were killed in the fire, and those were plants and animals. So this sense of kinship. I wrote 2 letters to my grandchildren. One of them is called Responsible by Degrees, trying to sort out the sense of responsibility. Who's responsible for what in the ecological destruction and degradation? So that's one letter. But the second letter is called It's All in the Pronouns. And that picks up on Robin Wall Kimmerer's sense of the grammar of animacy. That's a very different way of coming at responsibility. Because the first one, responsible by degrees, can still be handled by we changing our ways, and it isn't really changing our ways because it's still subject at acting on object, and object doesn't have it. In another place, I tried to say that when property becomes real, land becomes real estate and property, it loses any sense of the sacred. If it's commodified, there is no sacredness to it anymore. It's a matter for the market to be bought and sold, and maybe cared for in the language of stewardship, but it isn't sacred. So that some of those things are changing, and shows up in a search for ritual and a search for, I like your distinction of ritual and ceremony. I tended to conflate the two, make them synonyms. They aren't, and I can see that now. So thank you. But I'm still one of those that is trying to figure out the language of grieving for communities who are coming to a greater awareness
Mm.
of what wrong they have committed. We don't have it yet.
I see. Well, wow. Thank you, Larry. And before I tell my piece, say my piece, it's just an honor to hear both of you speak this way. And I want this to continue always. And if we could sit down and have lunch or whatever, I would do that with both of you. And it's just good to talk with human beings. But I want to go to, how just for 2 minutes here is how we as Indigenous people have to codify or standardize our language, our meaning, our concepts, if that's what it is, in order to speak English. How much we had to leave behind in order to get the definition without the meaning. And so in that way, I was described as that in the language of Lakota, you can just describe the energy and then the motion of the energy, you see, because it's not a constant. It's all, it's not stable. It's not stagnant. It's always moving, and sort of what Arlana was saying. But in how we're dealing with this in the tradition of the Lakota, this is my thoughts. The person who's grieving is considered wakan or most holy, and there's a sense that when someone is struck by, let's say lightning, or a loss, a sudden loss, and they are actually standing at that doorway or that edge or the ledge or the place of a spirit world, the threshold of spirit world, and that these prayers of those who grieve are considered strong, and it's proper to ask those peoples who are at that spirit threshold to ask them for help. And so these persons are, it helps them too to stay with reality in a sense. And that person has no layer of protection, nothing left to defend, where you're humble and vulnerable is a most powerful place. But in a Western world, that's a weak place to be. And so if you're escaping reality of loss, and has basically you're talking about the loss of the reality of land, and what came on the ships was that reality of loss of land and community with nature. So community is nature to us, whereas community is humans. So I wanted to bring that sort of this natural wisdom, this natural common sense that I think we need to speak. That's the common language I think where we need to fill in, and especially with the ceremonies and what we have here as in relationship compared to how do you say connection? Connection is a technical word. I know what it means in Latin. It's kind of the same thing, but relationship of who we are as compared with a tree, that relationship with a tree, rather than saying the earth, we say earth. We don't speak a distinct language. So I would just want to say it that far and stop, because I know, but it's an honor to have both of you on with this dialogue, Alice, and we'll bring Allison back to have her close up. And thank you, Larry and Arlana. It's just a great honor to have both of you here. Fast time. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, this has been one of those discussions that you'd like to go on for a couple more days, not even hours. I think that you all have come to the crux of the problem that we are all facing, and I think it's incredibly important to talk about listening to the Indigenous voice. I also think that there's something, Tiokasin, that you said about language and intuition. And I've always felt that the real crisis of our educational system is that it's never acknowledged intuition, because intuition is something in which we are part of the land and part of the spirit world.
Yeah.
So thank you, all three of you. This has been a really profound and beautiful experience for everyone. And I'm sure the same for all of you listeners. And thank you so much for being with us for the Eco Justice for All program, and especially for all of your contributions. I just want to quickly say that our next program, which is on January 18th, is a new era in climate action globally. So we're going to be tackling COP28 and what I call cop out 28. whatever we can get out of that and how we move forward is also a very critical issue for our time. So thank you all. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah. Intuition cannot be packaged.
Oh, no.
So thank you.
Thank you.